This episode is brought to you by an empty bottle of RC Cola. Why RC? Because I like RC. Boop. Drexus80 asks us the questions that will bring you to Talk Gaming Episode 05, Arcade Demise. Now, Drexus80 asked 3 questions, which we will bring to the table. Question 1, will arcades ever make a comeback? Question 2, will what's left close? Question 3, what needs to change? Now, I don't think this is the proper environment to answer such questions, so I will magically teleport you to a much better place. And with that, here we go. You see, now, I think this is the proper setting for these questions. This happens to be my private arcade. Private arcade. Get the gist of things here. Question number 1. Will arcades ever make a comeback? There really is only one answer. No. Arcades will never, ever be what they were in the early 80s, late 80s, early 90s. Those days are gone forever. You see, when arcades first came to the market, we'll take Pong for example. This was the first form of digital, games that was widely available to the public. Actually, if you do some research on Pong, day one of Pong being in location, they actually had an issue with the machine. So they had to call the vendors in to check it out. Turns out the vending machine, the Pong machine was filled with quarters. The bucket couldn't accept any more quarters. That was like the real first means of public arcade gamedom. And from there, you had a wide variety of games that came out for the arcades in the early 80s. Space Invaders, I'm standing right next to one. That came out, and arcade gaming in the initial years was basically to get high score. Now, with the game called Moon Patrol, that kind of changed stuff. They gave you the ability to continue, which gave the ability to, let's say, businesses and vendors to make more money, because some people would sit with 1 quarter and make it last hours getting that high score. With the ability to continue gaming, if you died, it gave vendors more money, and they gave operators more money also. So that's the early years. The problem with arcade gaming nowadays is that, much like arcade games, graphically and the concept for game and play wise and everything else, everything changed. Arcade gaming usually was a generation ahead of whatever the home console was producing. For example, down yonder is Ghosts and Goblins. Now, there was the Nintendo version, which is almost like the arcade, but not graphically. It took the Super Nintendo to almost emulate an arcade game. Now, Ghosts and Goblins came out in the middle of the 80s, and it took a Super Nintendo 10 years later to almost perfectly emulate that arcade machine. So, to translate what I'm saying, arcades usually were graphically a generation ahead of the console market. Now, this changed in the late 90s, where the graphics were almost the same level. I mean, you pick up Killer Instinct and you could play Killer Instinct on the N64. And there was supposed to be a rumor that the N64 was powering Killer Instinct, but that wasn't true. Anyway, what I'm basically trying to say is that we have come to a point where the consoles for the home market are providing better graphics, better gameplay, longevity than the arcades could ever have done. And that is pretty much the reason why we have a demise in gaming. Social gaming, as far as high scores and all that stuff, that's picked up between Xbox Live and PlayStation Network, where you can compete for high score on an online venue, as opposed to the arcade, where you would basically get a high score and be the local hero. So, arcades have demised mostly because of the current systems coming out with much better graphics. So, graphics have played a part. The fact that you can buy a game instead of wasting $4, $5, $6 at the arcades to play a game. And it's just a general feeling that what used to be public gaming has now taken the online form. You can now compete with somebody, a faceless individual if you will, online in a game as opposed to playing live. So with those factors, gaming as far as the arcades are concerned, not existent anymore. Now, the second question is, will what is left still be open? Well, general thesis of the question is, what will remain of the remaining arcades? What will happen? Now, the retro market will always be there, and there will always be arcades that will take great advantage of that retro market, and there's nothing wrong with that. Fun Spot in New Hampshire is a place where you can go and basically time travel to the early 80s, late 80s, because they have many, many, many arcade games across many generations. The mom and pop arcades, they're not gonna, like, what you see basically is pretty much the end of that. Arcades as a whole has basically dried up. The mom and pop shops, there's no interest in arcade gaming. I went to a local arcade at a mall recently, and it was, I think, one game of Dance Dance Revolution, and the rest of them were redemption machines. Redemption machines being the tickets that you get prizes up at the wall. You could exchange like 100 tickets for a piece of candy, which is kind of depressing. But mom and pop facilities as far as arcade gaming are concerned, they're not going to be around. Will the retro market be around? Absolutely, because with the fondness and the love, people will track these places down and continue to contribute their money, their time, just to be taken back to an earlier time. Now, what needs to change, the third question, what needs to change basically would be if developers and publishers kind of went after the retro market also. No need to continuously keep going forward with graphic presentation. Come up with a simple game like Space Invaders. Come up with something that's primitive. Use it as an online tool. Case in fact, play a old game of Space Invaders against somebody in, say, across the world for a high score. Is this a possibility? Of course it is. Is it going to happen? No. You see, developers are taking that idea and using it on such forums as Xbox Live, PlayStation Network, and WiiWare. The avenue of the arcades is dead. It's that simple. Will there ever be a resurgence? No. Now, personally, I have over 20 arcade games, but I also have the space for 20 arcade games because these machines not only weigh a lot, they take up a lot of space. And that's a whole different discussion for a whole different video, because what you have here are some dedicated machines, and they take space up, and they take a lot of space up. We'll get into that in another video. But if you are able to pick up an arcade machine, I strongly suggest it. That's if you're a gamer at heart, if you remember playing these games in your local arcade. If you're not that interested, then obviously I don't think that is an avenue you'd want to travel. Needless to say, I've traveled that avenue and I'm knee deep in it. But here's the thing about arcades. Certain machines obviously have held their value, such as Tron, Miss Pac-Man, Donkey Kong, kind of the genuine classics that have come from the arcade era. A lot of machines haven't though. But if you keep looking, keep the search out, you will find those popular titles for cheap prices. It's just a matter of waiting, and hoping that somebody doesn't beat you to such deals. This Space Invaders cost me $100. It works. Tri-Sports, mom and pop arcade went out of business, $75. Congo Bongo, which I hate with a passion. Don't get me wrong. It's an awesome looking cabinet, and it's like Donkey Kong's evil brother. It sucks. $25. This Miss Pac-Man I picked up for $100. Needed some attention, some work. Got it working for a little bit less than $150. I can keep going down the line. What I'm saying though is, if you keep looking, you'll find arcade games to be a cheap forms of, you know, gaming. First of all, it's a conversational piece. Secondly, it's the ability to play a classic game and have it for yourself. So, arcade demise, the topic of this talk gaming. Arcades will never be what they were once. That's a sad thing, because arcades, if you grew up with arcades, they were awesome. It introduced you to games, and introduced you to friends. You meet people there. You get to know somebody that normally you wouldn't have anything in common with, but your love for a particular arcade game, you made friends. And that's just it. So what are left of the arcade games? The arcade game business. If you see any arcades around you, visit them. If you could pick up an arcade machine, strongly suggested, but of course you need the space. Space is a very critical aspect of this whole thing. And that was Arcade Demise, Talk Gaming Episode 5. I'm the bartender. These are arcades. And I'm walking. Yes, indeed, and I'm talking. You and me, and I'm walking. And Simpsons 4 player all the way down here.